So I need a show of hands. How many people have familiarity with this story of Hagar? Pretty good. That's pretty good. I mentioned that I was going to tell the story of Hagar in worship today, and my husband said, "You mean Hagar the Terrible from the comic strip?" I have never preached on this text before, so if you're not very familiar with it, we're in the same boat. But I do love the story. I'm guessing that all of us are a little bit rusty on our Old Testament history and timeline. It's not like we read Genesis every single day, right? So let's kind of put this story of Hagar in a little bit of perspective. So far, Adam and Eve have had their time in paradise, and they've been kicked out of paradise. Cain has killed Abel. Noah and the great flood have happened. Generations have come and gone without much acclaim, and Abram has been called to be the founder of Israel, but he's not yet Abraham. There is not yet any Israel. There's no Exodus. There's no enslavement in Egypt yet. There's no 10 Commandments. The Israelite people have not yet even been formed when this story takes place. And although Abram, whom I'm going to call Abraham from here on out because it's just easier, although Abraham has been promised that he will be the father of a nation, that he will have many descendants, so far, Abraham and Sarah have not yet had a child at all. And so Sarah decides that what she will do is send in her Egyptian slave girl, Hagar, instead. Now, you got that right. Before the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt, there was an Israelite who had an Egyptian slave. Everything is all tangled up in the Old Testament. We're all kin. That's part of the point, I think, of the Old Testament. So she sends in Hagar, and in fact, Hagar gets pregnant. And then she's not very happy about what's going on, right? Hagar, of course, is very unhappy about what's going on. She has no power in the situation. She didn't want to do this anyway. Now she has a child. And now Sarah is treating her harshly. And so she goes out into the wilderness to escape this harsh treatment, knowing that she will probably die in the wilderness without anyone to take care of her, without food, without water. And God appears. And God says that God sees her affliction. God sees and responds. In fact, God promises to this Egyptian slave girl the very same promise that he gives to Abram. You will be the mother of a great nation. Descendants will call you their ancestor. She is stunned, right? That God sees her, that God cares for her, that God promises protection. And did you get this? She names God, El Roi, the God who sees, the God who sees her. And so she goes back to Sarah. She has the child, Ishmael, and they're all one big, not so happy family, until Sarah and Abraham have a child of their own, Isaac, and then you get a parallel event when, again, Sarah grows jealous, because now Hagar is not just a threat to her and her place in the family. Now this child, Ishmael, is a threat to Isaac. And so both Hagar and Ishmael are sent out into the wilderness where they will face certain death. And Hagar knows this. She leaves Ishmael under a tree because she can't stand to watch the death of her child. And again, God appears. And this time it is the God who hears her affliction. And God reminds her, I will make you the mother of a nation. And this child is special, very special. And in fact, all of the Arabic cultures of the world consider this story foundational, that Ishmael is their ancestor, Hagar is their mother. This story appears in a different form in the Quran as well. It's an incredible story when you really stop to think about it. We are taught a lot of things about our Bible and how to read it. We are taught first and foremost that it is a story about Israel, God's chosen, specially favored, unique people, insiders, if there ever were any insiders. We are taught that later on we were grafted onto this very special favored relationship through our relationship with Jesus Christ. But this is a story about us, a story of the specially favored insiders of God, right? Especially if you're a man. We're also taught this is a story about the great men of faith, and that women, if they're named at all, if they're recognized at all, play a very secondary role. That's what the Bible says. That's how we're told to read it. And yet, right here in the beginning, we have Hagar. She is nobody's definition of a leading biblical character. She's an Egyptian, not an Israelite. She's enslaved, not free. She is female, not male. She doesn't have any of the privileges of the correct relationship in marriage. She doesn't believe the right things about God. She is an outsider in every way, and yet God sees her and offers her the very same blessings that he offers to his number one insider, Abraham. In fact, Hagar is the only woman to ever be told she will be the ancestor of a nation, and the only person in the Bible with the power to name God. The only biblical character to do that. God sees. God sees insiders and outsiders. God sees oppression, hurting, vulnerability. God responds. God sees the people that we often forget. Because in God's kingdom, there aren't insiders and outsiders. There aren't us and them. It's the world that God has created and the human family that God desires. Do we see? Do we see? That was a question that Jesus asked the religious insiders of his own day. He was in the home of Simon the Pharisee, having a meal, when another outsider, a known sinner, comes in to the dining room. And she kneels at Jesus' feet, and she washes his feet with her tears. She covers his feet with oil from an alabaster jar and wipes it away with her hair. It is so intimate in such a public forum that Simon the Pharisee rightly judges the entire scene as inappropriate. And then he categorizes the entire situation, right? I'm in, she's out. I'm good, she's bad. I belong, she doesn't. And Jesus sees the whole thing very, very differently. He asks, Simon, do you see this woman? She's done nothing but love me, nothing but offer me kindness and generosity since the moment that she got here. What have you done exactly, Simon? She's been forgiven much. And so her heart is full of love and mercy. And you, Simon, you sit in judgment. You sit behind the line of good and bad and think that you can evaluate everyone else. You don't see your own need. And therefore, your heart is empty. Jesus says, the one to whom little is forgiven loves little. But the one who has been forgiven much shows great love. That's what matters to God, isn't it? The love we're able to give and receive. Do we see? Do we see people? Do we see what truly matters about them? I think even today, Jesus asks us this question, and even today we have to answer, not really, not very often. We don't really see people as they are, we see people as we are. We see prejudices, stereotypes, assumptions. We see what we expect to see. We see an interpretation of them based on how they make us feel or what we think about them. We see categories and descriptors that we think matter. Homeless man, Muslim child, Black woman, Democrat, Republican, wealthy, poor, trans, non-binary, straight, you name it. We categorize the world and put people in like social groups in order to make sense of things. Now, honestly, in some ways, this is not all about racism and sexism and classism. It is in some ways how our minds work. From the time we are very young, we learn about the world by recognizing what things have in common and what they don't, so that we can put them in groups, so that we can make sense of the world around us. It's just that when it comes to humanity and social relationships, we always sometimes get it wrong about what categories actually matter. And we also tend to overemphasize the differences and underemphasize our shared humanity. And when we do that, we end up creating an us versus them mentality. We end up living in a divided world, and it creates a lot of problems for all of us. We do live in a divided world, don't we? And I'm not just talking about the way we think about things. We literally live in a divided world. Do you remember what we've noticed over the last really multiple election cycles? As we look at the map, we can see that we are geographically divided and isolated based upon how we think about things politically, right? There's not a lot of overlap. You can see the geographic divisions. We are literally segregated around political understandings and ways of seeing the world. But that's not the only way. I know we think that we solved segregation in the 1950s. We didn't. In fact, we are more segregated today around issues of economic equality, around issues of race and neighborhood than we have been in decades. We are literally divided. We don't live in the same neighborhoods. We don't attend the same churches. Our kids don't go to the same schools. We don't run in the same parks or share the same restaurants or work in the same buildings. And what happens when we're divided like that? We don't see one another. We don't understand one another. We don't even know sometimes that we're living in very different realities because we don't share one another's joys and sorrows at an intimate level. We're divided. Do we even know, for example, the reality of just our fundamental economic inequality in this country? Data from last year, just from last year, showed that white Americans, an average white American, makes $24,000 more than an African American person, $32,000 more than a Hispanic American person. Asian Americans make a little bit more than white Americans, but when you start thinking about those differences, $20,000 to $30,000 every single year, that's a very different life experience. That's not a number. And think about it across time. Think about it intergenerationally. But we don't see it. We don't see that women with the exact same college education working in the same field still make less than men doing the same thing. Or that African Americans with college degrees still make about $20,000 less than their white counterparts. Our realities are different. because we live in this hyper-segregated society, we don't even notice. We don't notice the impact of policies and pronouncements and procedures that don't directly influence us. And because sometimes our neighbors look exactly like us, we don't even know that other people are suffering. We don't know what it might be like to hear that you won't have access to medical care when you're a trans kid living in Alabama. We don't know what it might be like to hear that same thing if you're a 13-year-old girl suffering from incest in Texas and wondering, will I have to bear the reality of this for the rest of my life? We don't know what it might be like to be the mother of small children who's here because her husband has a work visa, but she doesn't. And now there are threats of mass deportation. And we know because we don't really see that all immigrants and migrants get lumped together. What might she be feeling? What kind of fear might she be experiencing? We don't know because we don't see. The bottom line is this: you cannot love what you don't know. And we don't know one another very well in our divided society. So how can we live out God's call to love our neighbors, to love all of our siblings as ourselves? I want you to, for a moment, to take a look at the card that you were passed out. It's really simple, right? For just a moment, I want you to look. You'll notice on one side there's us. On the other side, there's them. When we operate with this mentality, we can't see everybody at the same time. There's a wall dividing us. So take a moment and just look at us. You can imagine who you might put in that category. When we're focused on us, we can't see them. We don't even notice what might be happening to them. Now turn the card over and look at them. Right? When we're preoccupied with our fear of them or our sense that they might be a threat, we can't see us. We can't even see ourselves and what might be happening within us. The barrier to relationship makes wholeness and understanding impossible. Jesus was about ripping down those barriers that divide us as the human family, to bring about wholeness, to help us see that we all belong to this God who sees us completely. What small things could we do to begin to see one another's experiences more completely? I want you to pause and just think about a person or a group of people that you might put in the category of them, whomever that might be. It might be a particular racial or ethnic group. It might be people from a particular country, people that practice a particular religion, people with a particular mental health status. Only you know. Could you, for the sake of the God who sees, commit to hearing one story about them told from their perspective, not yours? Could you this week, for the sake of the God who sees, intentionally seek out that story and just let it sit in your heart? You don't have to say you're going to believe it or trust it. Just let it reach you. What if the dream that everyone could thrive and live in peace was really still possible and growing in us? Jesus saw people. He saw us. He still does. He sees the pain and the strength the gratitude, the courage, and the struggles. He saw divine light in every person, even if it was buried underneath sin and greed and mistrust, or poverty, or false social expectations. He saw humanity even in people who looked for all the world like their hearts could never be changed. Jesus saw because he took the time to see. He saw with the mercy of God, and it made people well. It brought communities back together again, because he doesn't just see us individuals, he sees the whole, and invites us to begin to see like that as well. The one to whom little is forgiven loves little, but the one who has been forgiven much shows great love. Aren't we all in need of a little forgiveness? Don't we all need God to just come in and cleanse our eyes from time to time? Help us see the world and ourselves and one another in new ways. I think that's the first step in healing the divisions that plague us. So let's have the courage to see again, to see with a little more of the wholeness of God's perspective. I invite us to just join in a moment of prayer.